Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thanks so much for coming back to watch this video about how to prepare for law school exams. If you haven't subscribed yet, please click the button below and follow along for more videos about law school and travel and beauty and whatever else you guys would like to see. So today I'm going to be talking about law school exams. Now keep in mind that I've only been through 2 quarters of law school and they've both been at Stanford, so it's going to be a little bit, obviously specific to my experience. I can't say that every law school exam will be the way that I describe it, but this is just to sort of give you a baseline idea of what to expect. Because when I went into law school, I really had no idea what it was going to be like. And if you don't know, basically your class grade will almost be entirely based on your exam, if not 100% based on your exam. So as I mentioned in one of my previous videos, when you're taking classes, you're actually dealing with 2 different skill sets, your class preparation skill set and your exam skill set. And the way that you participate in class may actually have very little bearing on your final grade and vice versa. To start, I'll give a little bit of a sense of what an exam is actually like. So exams are not multiple choice for the first year. What they're testing is really your ability to analyze a legal issue that's been covered in class from many different angles. Typically, your first year exams will be something like an issue spotter, which is where the professor will write a scenario, generally a pretty complicated scenario, that sort of draws in different themes, threads, doctrines, specific cases from class. You'll just have to read the scenario and recognize what your professor is sort of alluding to. So for example, in a contracts exam, your professor might write a scenario in which, say, a young woman works for one company and then switches to another company. She signs this sort of employment contract and then wants to renege on it or something like that. And your job is to look at that scenario and answer the questions that follow it. And the questions will generally be pretty open-ended, like, what sort of legal claims can X person bring in this scenario? And you'll say, well, based on this given fact, she has a pretty strong claim for X doctrine, and that doctrine comes from this case. And, the scenario laid out in the exam is different from that case because XYZ. So you're basically going through a sort of stream of consciousness analysis during the exam. Our exams are, for the first year classes, the doctrinal classes, are usually, let's say, like 3 to 4 to 4.5 hours long. We type them, and you basically bring your laptop and your printed outline of your notes from the class into the exam room. You sit down and you just sort of type away for 3 to 4 hours as fast as you can without stopping. That's basically the only way that you'll be able to get to every issue. It's kind of interesting because there is a right answer in a sense. The scenario that's being written is pointing you in a pretty specific direction a lot of the time. And if you go off on a tangent, you're not going to get points for going on that tangent. So, that's sort of incorrect. But it isn't as rigidly defined as like a multiple choice exam. So even if you miss one part or you don't spot an issue, there's still a way to do really well if you have a strong and sort of clear analysis in other areas. So one preparation tip that I actually think you should do before you come to law school, weirdly enough, is to just get fast at typing. Your typing speed strangely comes to matter a lot because in that 3 to 4 hours, you're basically competing with other people in your class, although the level of competition may vary depending on who's in your class and, the sort of atmosphere of your school. But in a general sense, you are competing against the other people in your class for that grade. And every little bit helps. I mean, if you're a faster typer, that means you can get more onto the page and you can get more points down the line. I kind of didn't realize this. I mean, even though law school is a pretty sort of analog discipline still, like we read case books, some people take notes by hand. At the end of the day, when it comes to exams, it's going to be all typing. I mean, when I study for exams, I end up typing more than anything else, more than reading. I type for maybe like 8 hours a day in the days leading up to the exam. And I'll get to why in a moment. But the very first thing to remember is typing speed. I mean, for most millennials and like people my age and younger, it's not really an issue, but you'd be kind of surprised how much that ends up mattering. Okay, so moving on to more concrete steps of exam preparation. Your exam preparation actually begins the very first day of class. Sad to say. There's not really, at least in my experience, there's not a way to sort of phone it in during the quarter and then come in at the end and really try to make it up during the exam prep time. especially, or at least for 1Ls. I'm not sure what it's like 2L and 3L when you're taking elective classes, but for these foundational doctrinal classes, where the grades are really going to set the sort of tone for the rest of your time in law school, you just have to sort of keep the exam in mind as you start class. And what I mean by that is taking really organized notes and trying your hardest to brief the cases yourself if you have time and can handle it. A lot of people use, commercial briefs like Quimby or Case Briefs or, different websites, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with that per se, but you really don't absorb the material the same way if you skim a case brief that someone else prepared versus writing that brief out yourself. And if you want a little bit more information about what briefing a case means, please check out my other video, What I Wish I'd Known in Law School, where I talk about that more. So my briefing method, basically, when I'm reading for the class, in my casebook, I have like a 5 or 6 color highlighting system. I know it sounds crazy, but if you're going to law school, you're probably that type of person anyway. You probably already have 10 highlighters, so you're ready for this. As I read, I color code and highlight things, and then when I type up my case brief, I can just sort of pull visually the chunks of color that I need into each section, so it's a lot more efficient that way. And it actually doesn't take that much longer and is a good way to review the reading for the next day. It kind of goes without saying that in class, especially if your professor is the type to lecture or put a lot of concrete information in slides, you need to be taking really good notes. I suggest so what I do to take notes is use Microsoft Word, link to my Dropbox, and then for the headings of each class and for case names, I'll use the styles built into Microsoft Word so that I can auto-generate a table of contents later. I basically take my notes in outline form, which makes it that much easier to import to an outline later. So yeah, basically just trying to make sure that you really stay on top of those class notes. I mean, you may do the reading every single day super thoroughly. I find that if I don't take notes though, it's almost impossible to keep everything straight, especially when you have multiple classes going on. You're stressed, you're trying to figure out this new method of studying and being in class. So giving yourself strong notes from the beginning is a really, really useful foundation for what's to come later. The next step in your preparation will be to make your outline. So when I say outline, it's just one of those things that you never think about till you come to law school, and then it seems like the day you step on a campus, people are like talking about it in the background. But an outline is basically what it sounds like. It's a condensed version of your class notes with all the essential information that you will use as a reference point during the exam. So for us, we type our exam in a Microsoft Word document and we're allowed to have a printed outline that we bring with us. And it sounds very comforting to have an outline with you on the day of, but I have found that because of the time limitation, if you don't already have all of that information in your head, you're not going to be able to page through your outline slowly and like reread cases and think like, oh, I need to find this doctrine. Where is the doctrine in my outline? What does this doctrine mean again? What case was it? You're going to lose very precious time and it's not going to work out very well. The outline is really more about the process of creating that outline rather than the finished product that you have in the exam room with you. And the process of creating that outline is the way that you will review all of the information and translate it from this unwieldy class notes package into something that is usable. I basically make 2 outlines. The first outline that I make is a pretty full version of my class notes. I mean, I do edit it down a little bit, but it's basically the reference point. So it contains almost everything that I might conceivably need to know for the exam. And for the typical quarter-long class, 1L fall, my outline was probably between 70 and 100 pages, so pretty long. I also make something called an attack outline, which is basically a 2 to 3 page, very condensed sort of checklist for each area of the class. Let's say Civ Pro, I will make an attack outline that says, if the question is about personal jurisdiction, here are the 3 or 4 points that I know I must hit. And I'll also add a couple of notes for myself with regard to things that I personally normally miss in practice questions. So that way when I'm doing the exam, I do actually know the information in my head for the most part. And then I can use my attack outline as a sort of final checklist before I move on to the next question, just to make sure that in the heat of the moment, when I'm stressed during the exam, I didn't forget a sort of fundamental part or a little detail that I normally miss, but that might put my exam over the edge and make it a good one. So for the outline, the way that you make it is really up to you. Some people use commercial outlines like Barbary outlines. I wouldn't really recommend that because it's a little bit too generalized. I mean, you want to try to make an outline or find an outline that is specific to your professor's approach, because obviously not every torts class is going to cover all of the same doctrines, for example. There's not enough time in that term to cover that entire area of law. You don't want to get an outline where there's sort of an adjacent doctrine that sort of seems like you might have covered it, but you didn't really, and then you were looking at the outline and you waste time sort of trying to learn something new that you won't need on the exam. For us, we have an outline database where previous students can upload their outlines, and you can use that as a starting point or a reference. That's called a shell outline. So that's what I basically do. About a month and a half before, maybe closer to 2 months before 1L fall exams, I took a look at the database, sort of picked the shell outlines that I wanted to use and sort of perused them. I mean, you'll get varying levels of intensity. Some people download a shell outline like the first week of class, use it to sort of anticipate where the class is going to go and like pre-study. I don't really think that's necessary. I mean, from what I can tell, I don't know whether those people know the material that much better. I mean, the chances are just that your class contributions will be shaped by that outline, and you'll kind of sound like you're parroting someone else's words, even if you don't mean to when you're contributing in class. You don't want to be the person who is, just a tiny bit ahead and uses that little bit of advanced preparation to try to sound smarter than the rest of the class, because it's not going to impress your professor. They have been probably teaching that class for years and know everything about the area, and like whatever little advantage you were able to get from someone else's outline, they've heard it all before. And it just doesn't come across as very, collegial, I guess. It's hard. I mean, you can do what you want, but I also just don't think it's very necessary preparation-wise. Making yourself a study schedule is also extremely important. For 1L fall, we had 4 exams basically spaced out with 1 day in between each. That is a lot of exams within a very short period of time, and so I needed to make a schedule where I blocked out the day into a morning chunk and an afternoon/evening chunk, and I would assign myself, this morning I'm doing crim, this afternoon I'm doing torts. That way I didn't have to make that decision the day of and maybe accidentally assign less time to one subject over another. It also can be really helpful to have a study group. I don't know that it's super necessary that, you'll fail if you don't have a study group, or, having a study group means you're going to do really well. But it is really nice to have sort of a backup group of friends to just sort of de-stress with sometimes, and also to hold you accountable. I mean, accountability is the main thing. That's why you make a study schedule. That's why you make an outline. That's why you have your study group. A lot of law school is not really about aptitude for the law, because a lot of times the law is so artificial and so constrained by these rules that seem to make no sense. It would be very strange for someone to have a natural aptitude for picking that up. It's really about being able to hold your nose to the grindstone, hold yourself accountable, and just make sure that the work gets done. If you can do that, you're going to do really well. The most useful thing that your study group will be able to do is to go over old practice exams. In my experience, professors provide at least 1 or 2 practice exams. Sometimes there's an online database through the school, or sometimes the professor will provide it themselves. But the practice exams are invaluable for 2 reasons. I mean, they give you a sense of the way that the professor structures the hypothetical, what their exam looks like and what they expect. And it gives you a practice so that, just the way that you studied for the LSAT, for example, doing practice exams alleviates some of that unknown that contributes to stress, and also gets you in sort of the physical habit of doing these exams, because it is very unnatural to sit somewhere for 3 or 4 hours just typing nonstop, sort of word vomiting the answers, because that's basically what you're going to do. You shouldn't be under any illusion that the exam that you produce will be a beautiful piece of writing, because you're going to be typing, let's say, between 14 and maybe like 22 pages during that 3 to 4 hour period, depending on the circumstance. And there's just no way that you can sort of structure it and edit it beautifully. It's just going to be what you can get out onto the page. So taking a practice exam is very, very useful for that, and pretty much essential. That is the way that you study. I mean, I don't really do much besides take a lot of practice exams. I put together the outline, read it maybe once or twice, but I don't rely on reading the outline over and over to study, because it's not really the best way for the information to absorb into your brain. It should already kind of be there, and the outline is a refresher. Then I take practice exams, and then I take the real exam. That's pretty much it. A lot of times you can go into office hours and discuss your answers to the practice questions and sort of get your professor's take on the way that you approach the question, whether you have any sort of deficiencies in your answer, and that is also really helpful. And finally, I would say just try not to stress too much. I mean, the good and the bad thing is that I feel a lot of your preparation for your exam happens throughout the quarter or throughout the semester. So, if you stay on top of it, exam prep time is obviously going to be very stressful and difficult, but on the other hand, you're ready for it. And finally, I would say that even though your grade for the quarter or the term is determined by the exam, your grades are not the only thing that matters. And in a lot of ways, they're just sort of a benchmark or a hoop to jump through. But your relationships with your professors, the activities you do, the clubs you join, the pro bono hours that you work, all of that will contribute to the fully rounded experience that you have in law school, and all of those things are going to give you experiences that will make you a good lawyer in the future. It's not the end-all be-all when it comes to the exam. So if you feel like you could have done better, and obviously we all could always do a little bit better, there's no need to beat yourself up, because the exam is both a very artificial thing and it's one very specific way of testing knowledge that doesn't necessarily indicate whether you are smart or whether you know the doctrine or whether you're going to be a good lawyer. It's just very specific to law school. That's pretty much it for this introduction to exams. I hope that it was helpful. If you guys want to see other videos on other topics, please let me know in the comments or let me know what you think. If you have other ways of preparing for exams that you find really helpful, I'd also love to hear that as well, because as you know, I've really only been through 2 cycles, and while my methods kind of worked out the first time, we'll see about the second time. Who knows if they'll keep working. I always want to hear more from you guys. So go ahead and leave me a comment below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.